Hi, how you doing? So this video is going to be on, I think probably going to pick three of the most common mistakes that you'll probably make if either I don't tell you or somebody else doesn't tell you, or you will learn yourself or have learned yourself. So I guess it's depending on where you're entering property development from. So the three really important tips. So number one is it's easy for someone to say know your numbers. That's only all well and good when, of course, you're 5 years down the run and you've experienced where the numbers work and where they don't. This is something really to understand. So you're never going to know your numbers. That's impossible until you've done development yourself, and actually until you've had some hard hits is only when you really fully understand them. And then, of course, you've got to work your way through those situations, because you don't want that to necessarily tarnish your behaviour, because it could put you off to development so much, or make the numbers that you're so you're pessimistic with the numbers that it makes it almost impossible to win anything again in the future. So there's an element of a balanced view. To be emotional, but at the same time not to be too emotional when it comes to what you want to be buying. So the numbers, let's just cover that off. So the numbers are, there's five big numbers essentially. So the working backwards, I think it's five or six, but I'll work backwards. So first of all is GDV. So GDV, the gross development value, is what it's worth at the end. It's like when you're buying a house, what's the house worth first? And then, of course, you work backwards. And that's essentially where you start. Because once you know your exit, so if it's 2 million or 1 million or 500,000 or whatever your situation is, 5 million, 50 million, you know where your GDV sits. Then you work backwards. And, of course, then you need to work out what your finance costs are. So how much is the cost of the finance to borrow, or your joint venturing, i.e. someone's lending you the money, or they're the person putting the equity in and getting a profit share. You know, ultimately, regardless of your position, how much is the finance costing? So that's something else to understand. Then there's the professional fees. So the professional fees are anything over and above the build work. So these are things like architect's costs. This is pre-getting to planning and post. Even when something's got planning permission, you'll still need some architect's input afterwards. Construction issue drawings is what's something that's very well regarded and what's needed. And structural engineering costs, maybe party wall surveyors. That's where if a building or a building is quite close to your building that's being built, it can sometimes affect the footings. So sometimes, or it's attached. So if the two buildings are attached, a party wall surveyor is employed for both sides, yours and theirs, to make sure that anything structurally changes on their wall or garage or whatever's on their side, that you then have to cover the costs of those repairs. But at the same time, it highlights that if there is any disrepair on their land or building or whatever it is prior to you building, you're not going to get blamed for it. So what else have we got? So we've got things like SIL, community infrastructure levies, Section 106, affordable housing contribution. All of these things we put into professional costs or fees. So that's anything over and above build. You then got the build cost. Generally, what's a familiar term is a cost per square foot. So if you're building, I don't know, 10,000 square feet of flat, so that's how big the building is, and you're blending that at say 180 or 190 pound a square foot, it's 190 times 10,000. So I'm giving it a very blended overview here, but that tends to be a cost per square foot will give an element of a blended appraisal. You've then got your purchase price, which is almost like the last cost that you're looking at. Once you've worked out the rest, GDV, finance costs, professional fees, build costs, then the purchase price in effect will be presented. Now there's other things in there like marketing costs, estate agency costs, the stamp duty, the legal cost that you're buying it, the legal cost for selling it, the conveyancing to sell all the units, unless you're buying it as one, selling it as one investment to one buyer, like an investment buyer. But regardless, there's going to be some other peripherals. But essentially, there's your 5 big numbers to consider. So there are things to note. So the 3 biggest mistakes: know your numbers, know all of those. Now, how are you going to know all of those? So again, like I mentioned in my video number 1 was where to start. So essentially, speak to mortgage brokers, understand the cost of finance. If it's senior debt lending, development finance, what kind of loan to value are you getting? Therefore, how much equity is required, i.e. how much cash is needed to go in towards the purchase of the land. And then where does that money come from? Is it yours? Is it being borrowed? Or are you going to get an equity partner to put that part in, and then you have a partnership where you split 50-50, or because they put the money in, they're going to want a higher profit share, so you're not personally at risk for that money, which is, I would say, is definitely certainly when you're coming from a place where you don't have any money in the first place to be able to input or even risk against. You're not in that leveraged position. So there's a few things for you to consider, but of course if you are and do, very different scenario, you're all putting skin in the game. But time, effort, resource is as when you don't have the funds, is as much as risk in the game as someone else putting the money, hands down, because it depends on where you're coming from. So those are the few things that one thing there to consider. So know your numbers, but there's a bit of an indication of what to look out for. GDV, of course, you can get that from your gross development value. You can get those values from estate agents and get an indication from there. Your build cost, really. I think this is all varied, but I'm just going to give you some rough indicators. But typically, if you're in and around London, I mean, please don't take my word for this. You're going to get these. This will depend on the experience, the size of the developer, and the contractors, and so on. The complexity, flats versus houses. Stories are more money, so the more stories, that's going to come with greater build costs. But just to give you kind of an element of a blend, if you're in and around London, you're probably looking at around 220 a square foot. Houses will be less depending on the infrastructure size, roads and things, but maybe around the £200 per square foot, maybe a bit higher, maybe a bit lower depending if you're the contractor yourself and you're not carrying the profit margin costs because it's your development. So there's some caveats there. If of course you're going more towards Midlands and up north, you might be getting maybe 170 a square foot, something like that, because the build costs right now are rising and it's a little bit of uncertainty, but that just gives you a bit of an indication. And 20% profit margin really is where you want to be sitting after all of those costs, give or take. That's kind of where you're going to get the traction with lenders and so on. But this will depend, of course, if you're the person that's going out for the money, the equity, and of course where they see their profit margins. They might want slightly higher, they might take slightly less. So this is all a bit caveated. So that's something to look at, and I hope that you found that useful. So the second thing to look out for, to look out for, is not chasing something for you to make the numbers work. So that's something really I would hugely point you towards. I've done it myself. You so want the scheme, it's been a while since you found one, you've not found any yet, and you try to engineer it. I wonder if we could do it for 170 a square foot. You just can't, maybe, or 160, or you're trying to make the numbers work, or you're trying to find values in something that just don't exist and are not there. It's a lot of time spent, a lot of time wasted. You're managing the expectations incorrectly with the landowner, and it only ends up in rows with the landowner if you've then got to reassess, reappraise, and you've got to change the numbers six weeks down the trip because you've now got different contractor costs in and it hasn't worked out. So these are the things for you to consider. Don't chase a deal based on your own numbers. The numbers will dictate whether this works or not, but you need to understand those numbers, and the only way you're going to understand those numbers is time, appraising lots of opportunities, and of course getting all that information from those various people I've just described. So I hope that really helps you too. Also, tip number 3. So this is what I would certainly say in development. Only do development in and around where you are. Okay, so this is something that I was told a long time ago, and I largely ignored it, which is something that I'll live and learn. But when you're not near a scheme, developments are challenging anyway. They just are. Certainly when you haven't done it before. Obviously, it's like going into something, even if you have been in something before, property development always is challenging. It depends, you know, the more, what comes with experience, of course, is confidence. What comes with naivety is confidence, because you don't know what you don't know. So depending on which place you come from, but it will inevitably push you out your comfort zones, regardless as to where you're coming from. So when it's local to you, I'm talking perhaps within travelling distance, within an hour of where you are, you need to be able to get to it. You need to be able to see it, you need to be able to meet contractors on site. Now, it depends on what part you're playing here. If you're actually involved in the build, in the construction itself, and you're playing a more of an active role in it, then that's different. But there's a fairly high chance that you'll be doing like an overseeing role, tends to be, where a contractor's doing the build and you're kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together, regardless of the size. And again, if you're in partnership with someone, by the way, I absolutely advocate that. If you haven't done property development before, very easy to want to do a lot of these things on your own. Again, depending on your financial situation, depending on where you are firmly in being comfortable. Not only that financially, but also in time. So if you're in full-time work, which I have to say, lots of developers are in full-time work, and property development is a side hustle. So that will come with huge stresses. So I suggest going into some form of partnership with someone, because that alleviates a lot of that. But of course, that comes with partnership challenges, which can go fantastically well, and sometimes they just don't. So again, there's partnership structures that'll be another video, that can help you and them get the most flexibility of being able to either part ways, if that's okay, because sometimes it just doesn't work, and that's okay. Either personality or personal circumstances can make that shift. You need those kind of conversations to be had early on both parts, depending on, are you the one putting the money in all the time, or you're both putting in a bit of both? So of course that depends. So I hope those three things, there's lots of other tips. I'm going to do some more videos on tips, things to watch out for. There's things like, I'll go through things like right of access, archaeology, things to note that have been mentioned on the planning decision, that are things just to watch out for. That's got to need to get that covered off. Things like charges or covenants, things to note on deeds, got caught in that too. So there's lots of things to keep an eye out on. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll keep them coming. So please do comment. You know, it takes time and things to do these videos. So I hope that you're finding these useful. I'll keep them coming, and maybe I'll even change the top. Who knows? But anyway, speak to you soon. Cheers.